There is a moment in the historical record that most researchers walk past without stopping. It appears in a single line of an ethnographic report filed in 1881 by a surveyor named Harold Fenn, working under contract for the Canadian Geological Survey. The line reads, almost as an aside, "The elder, when pressed further on the nature of the underwater formations, declined to speak. He stated only that some knowledge was not given to be shared with those who had not already found it." That is the entirety of the notation. Fenn moves on without returning to the subject, but embedded in that refusal is a question the official record has never seriously asked. What did the Iroquois elders know about what lies beneath Lake Ontario, and why, for generations before 1881, did they refuse to say it? This is not a story about myth or legend, or the romantic projection of ancient wisdom onto indigenous peoples for narrative colour. This is a story about a specific pattern of silence that appears across. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. More than 2 centuries of European Iroquois contact. A silence that only broke in fragments starting in the 1870s, and a silence that, when examined against the physical record of the lakebed, begins to look less like cultural tradition and more like deliberate information management. Something is on the floor of Lake Ontario. The question is what it is, how old it is, and why the people who lived above it for centuries chose not to describe it to outsiders until they were, in the words of one late 19th century account, certain the time for concealment had passed. If you find value in recovering what the official record decided wasn't worth keeping, share this with someone who still asks questions. Lake Ontario sits at the eastern end of the Great Lakes chain, covering roughly 7,300 square miles between what is now southern Ontario and upstate New York. Its average depth is around 283 feet, with a maximum depth approaching 800 feet in its eastern basin. It drains eastward into the St. Lawrence River and receives inflow from Lake Erie through the Niagara system to the west. By every standard geological account, Lake Ontario is a post-glacial feature, the basin carved by ice sheets and filled between 13,000 and 10,000 years ago as the glaciers retreated northward. Beneath the current waterline, sediment layers record the transition from glacial outwash to lacustrine deposit. That is the official account, well supported by core samples across much of the lake bed. But there are anomalies in those samples, not enough to overturn the consensus, but enough, when examined carefully, to suggest the lake floor is not entirely what it appears to be. In 1972, a joint Canadian-American bathymetric survey of Lake Ontario produced a detailed acoustic profile of the lake bed, partially declassified and published in a Geological Survey of Canada technical report. Buried in the appendices, under a section labelled Anomalous Reflectance Profiles, are 18 locations across the eastern and central basin where the acoustic return does not match expected lacustrine sediment. In 14 of those locations, the anomalous return was attributed to possible bedrock outcrop or consolidated substrate of uncertain origin. 4 locations were not attributed to anything. They were listed as anomalous and left unresolved. The coordinates of those 4 locations correspond, within the margin of error of 1970s era equipment, to an area of the lake bed roughly 12 miles northeast of the present shoreline near the mouth of the Trent River system, a region that the Iroquois Confederacy, in oral historical accounts recorded in the late 19th century, referred to by a name that translates approximately as the place where the walls still stand. That translation appears in a single document, a set of field notes compiled by ethnographer Horatio Hale, during his work with the Six Nations in the 1870s and 1880s. Hale was a serious scholar, not given to embellishment, and his notes are notable for their precision. The phrase, "the place where the walls still stand," is one of two references to underwater structures. The second describes a location to the west, closer to the present site of Toronto, called the Drowned Foundations. Hale did not pursue either reference. His notation is the only surviving scholarly record of these toponyms before they disappeared from the accessible ethnographic literature. The Iroquois Confederacy, or Haudenosaunee, is one of the most thoroughly documented indigenous political systems in North American history. The League, comprising the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and later Tuscarora nations, maintained a sophisticated political structure and a deep oral historical tradition. European contact in the Lake Ontario region began in earnest in the early 17th century, with the French establishing trading relationships beginning in the 1610s. What is consistent across virtually all early European accounts is a description of Lake Ontario as a place of profound familiarity, not merely practical. Early Jesuit missionaries described it with puzzlement as a place of particular veneration and a body of water with significance beyond its practical uses. The Jesuit Relations, published annually in France between 1632 and 1673, are among the most detailed records of the contact period, full of small observations that never received adequate follow-up. In the relation for 1648, a Jesuit named Father Gabriel Lalemant records a conversation with a Seneca man near the western shore of the lake. The translation is approximate, and the original has the interpretive difficulties inherent in all colonial-era cross-cultural records. But the substance is this: the Seneca man told Lalemant that the lake held within it the remains of an earlier people, and that these remains were not bones but buildings, and the buildings were made of a stone that did not come from this land. Lalemant does not pursue the claim. He moves on to conversion prospects, but he wrote it down. That notation sits in an archive in Paris. It has been cited occasionally in discussions of Iroquois cosmology, interpreted as reference to an underwater spirit world. But Lalemant was a trained observer with strong incentives to distinguish metaphor from literal claim, since the distinction mattered for his missionary work. The phrase he uses in the original French is not spiritual allegory, it is material description, the stone that did not come from this land. The geology of the Lake Ontario basin is dominated by limestone, dolostone, and shale of Ordovician and Silurian age, the bedrock units outcropping around the lake's margins and forming the substrate beneath the glacial sediments. This is what you would quarry for construction in this region, and it is what virtually every indigenous and post-contact structure in the area was built from when stone was the material of choice. The phrase, "stone that did not come from this land," is therefore a specific and technically meaningful observation, pointing to the presence of a non-local lithology in whatever structures were being described. This matters because the acoustic data from the 4 anomalous locations return signatures not consistent with local carbonate bedrock. 2 of the 4 locations produced a return that one survey author, in an internal memo obtained through an access to information request filed in 1994, described as possibly granitic or high silica material inconsistent with expected Ordovician carbonate substrate. Granite is not native to the Lake Ontario basin. The nearest significant granite formations are in the Canadian Shield, hundreds of miles from the anomalous survey locations. Someone moved stone. The question is when and who. The 1881 moment did not appear in isolation. It was the culmination of a decade of fragmentary disclosures beginning in the early 1870s that appear, in retrospect, to have been a coordinated and deliberate partial opening of a tradition of silence maintained for as long as the contact period record goes back. By the 1870s, the political and territorial situation of the Iroquois nations had been fundamentally transformed. The major land cession treaties had been signed. The Six Nations Reserve on the Grand River was under sustained pressure from land speculators, and the remaining Iroquois territories in New York were similarly compressed. In that context, the partial disclosure of guarded knowledge takes on a specific character. It is not capitulation, not simply the erosion of cultural practice under colonial pressure. It looks in the sources like a deliberate decision by certain elders that the period of concealment was ending, not because the knowledge no longer mattered, but because the conditions that made concealment necessary no longer obtained. The pattern of silence about Lake Ontario's underwater features is not the only such pattern in the Haudenosaunee record. There are analogous patterns regarding certain Finger Lakes locations, specific construction techniques used in pre-contact longhouse communities, and what several 19th century ethnographers described as the old settlements said to predate the Confederacy itself. The Haudenosaunee oral tradition acknowledges a deep past. The founding of the Confederacy is placed by various accounts anywhere from 900 to 1450 CE, with the academic consensus settling near 1450 CE. Before the Confederacy, the tradition describes a period of conflict and fragmentation among the nations that would become the Iroquois. But there are also references, in the older layers of the oral record, to something preceding even that period. These references are fragmentary, appear inconsistently across different nations' traditions, and have been treated by scholars as cosmological rather than historical. They describe an earlier time when the land was different, when certain places now underwater were not, and when there were structures in the landscape not made by the people who eventually became the Haudenosaunee. Lewis Henry Morgan, whose 1851 work, The League of the Haudenosaunee, remains a foundational text in Iroquois studies, recorded one of the clearest such references. In a section dealing with Iroquois cosmology, Morgan notes that several informants described ruins beneath the waters of the Great Lake to the north as the remnants of a people who came before all peoples, who built in ways that are no longer possible. Morgan placed this in the category of myth. He did not follow it up, did not ask what ways that are no longer possible meant, or whether his informants distinguished this account from cosmological narrative as opposed to historical account. That distinction, in Haudenosaunee oral tradition, is actually quite clear. The Iroquois maintained a sharp internal distinction between cosmological narrative, the stories of creation, the sky world, the conflict between the good mind and the evil mind, and historical account. Historical accounts were preserved with care for accuracy because they served practical functions: treaty negotiation, territorial claim, legal precedent. The references to underwater ruins appear across the sources in what the Haudenosaunee themselves categorized as historical account, a significant detail that almost every scholar who encountered these references either missed or overlooked. If the ruins are historical rather than mythological in the Haudenosaunee categorization, the question of their age becomes considerably more pointed. The standard post-glacial model places the filling of Lake Ontario at roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years before present. If structures exist on the lake bed, they were either built during a period of very low lake stand, which is geologically possible as Great Lakes levels fluctuated significantly in the early Holocene, or they were built when the lake basin was not a lake at all. There is evidence for lake levels several hundred feet below the present surface during the period roughly 10,000 to 9,000 years ago. During this low stand, significant portions of the present lake bed would have been exposed land. The areas corresponding to the four anomalous acoustic returns would, at a sufficiently low lake level, have been above water. The question is whether human occupation of those exposed areas is plausible, and whether the structures being described could represent physical remnants of construction activity from 9,000 to 10,000 years before present. The conventional archaeological record for human presence in the Lake Ontario region goes back to roughly 11,000 years before present. These were Paleo-Indian populations, small and mobile, following the retreating glaciers northward. They are not, in the standard model, populations that build in stone. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. But the standard model has been under pressure from sites that do not fit its assumptions. Monteverde in Chile pushed the arrival of humans in the Americas back well beyond the Clovis threshold. Evidence from coastal and lacustrine environments suggests the absence of construction-level archaeology from the early Holocene may reflect taphonomic bias, the systematic destruction of evidence by inundation, rather than the actual absence of construction. Sites above water 10,000 years ago and now under hundreds of feet of lake water are not going to be found through terrestrial archaeology. They require underwater survey. The 1972 survey was acoustic, not visual. Its anomalous return suggests something worth examining. But no detailed follow-up survey of the 4 anomalous locations has been published. An internal memo from 1994 suggests a targeted sonar survey was proposed and budgeted by the Canadian Geological Survey but not carried out due to what the memo describes as reallocation of survey priorities. What those priorities were reallocated to is not specified. Horatio Hale spent the better part of a decade working with the Six Nations of the Grand River beginning in the late 1870s. His unpublished field notes are archived at the Royal Ontario Museum, publicly accessible but voluminous, partially indexed and not fully digitized. The full content has never been systematically analysed. What is accessible in the index portions includes notes dated to the summer of 1879, recording a conversation with an elder of the Cayuga Nation, whose name Hale renders phonetically as Sawahon Air. The conversation began as a discussion of traditional fishing practices, and moved, at the elder's own initiative, to the subject of underwater features of the lake. Hale's notes summarise the substance of what the elder communicated, that there were structures on the lake bottom there since before the waters covered them, that these structures were known to the elders of all 6 nations of the Confederacy, that knowledge of them was maintained within specific lineages and transmitted through ceremonial channels, that the structures were made of stone that is not from this country, and that their purpose was related to the management of the water and the air. The management of the water and the air. Hale does not analyse this phrase, he records it and moves on to a notation about the condolence ceremony. The phrase is easy to dismiss as spiritual language, as reference to ritual practice with nothing to do with physical infrastructure. But consider the possibility that what the elder was describing was not metaphor but technical function, where the structures were understood, within the tradition that maintained knowledge of them, as having a practical purpose related to the movement of water and the behaviour of the atmosphere. This is where the Tartarian infrastructure hypothesis intersects with the Lake Ontario evidence in a way that is more specific than most such intersections tend to be. The Tartarian infrastructure argument, in its most technically rigorous form, does not claim a global empire erased from history. It claims something more precise, that there is a category of physical infrastructure distributed across multiple continents, constructed using techniques and materials not accounted for by the historical periods to which they have been attributed, and that these structures share design and functional characteristics suggesting a common origin or tradition. One characteristic is scale, construction exceeding the practical needs of the populations officially credited with it. Another is durability, material choices prioritizing longevity far beyond what immediate use would require. A third is placement, structures located at specific geological and hydrological features, river confluences, lake shores, aquifer boundaries, tectonic boundaries, in ways suggesting awareness of subsurface conditions not attributable to casual observation. The placement criterion is particularly relevant to the Lake Ontario anomalies. The 4 locations in the 1972 survey are not randomly distributed. 2 correspond, when projected onto modern bathymetric maps, to what would have been the shores of a significantly reduced Lake Ontario during a Holocene low stand, specifically the old shoreline, the lake's edge when it was smaller and shallower, before the modern Great Lakes drainage configurations were fully established. The other 2 locations are at depth in the eastern basin, corresponding to the trace of a geological fault system running northeast-southwest through the eastern lake bed. This fault system is mapped. It is exactly the kind of feature where, in the Tartarian infrastructure framework, you would expect to find engineered structures, not because faults are inherently useful for construction, but because an advanced technical tradition would have had reasons to locate infrastructure at boundaries between geological units. The management of water and air, in engineering terms, might describe a system interacting with subsurface hydrology, the movement of groundwater through fractured rock, thermal differentials driving convective circulation in deep lake systems, or the acoustic properties of a deep lacustrine basin. These are physical functions that a sophisticated understanding of geology and fluid dynamics could design infrastructure to serve. The question is whether any such understanding existed at a time when structures could have been built on what is now the lake bed. The available evidence supports this. There are anomalous features on the floor of Lake Ontario that have not been adequately investigated. There is a long tradition of Haudenosaunee knowledge holders declining to discuss those features with outsiders. That tradition of silence broke in partial and controlled ways in the 70s and 1880s. The descriptions offered in those disclosures are consistent with constructed features of non-local stone at locations that would have been above water during early Holocene lake low stands. And the 1972 acoustic survey returned anomalous results at locations corresponding geographically to what the Haudenosaunee oral tradition identified as significant. None of this is conclusive. The systematic failure to follow up, reallocation of survey priorities, filing of anomalies without attribution, treatment of elder testimony as myth rather than historical account. That pattern is itself worth examining. The 1881 disclosure was not the last partial opening of Haudenosaunee knowledge about Lake Ontario's underwater features. There were at least 2 more, both occurring in the 1890s, both recorded in sources not primarily concerned with the subject. The first is in the correspondence of archaeologist David Boyle, curator of the Ontario Provincial Museum from 1886 to 1911. In a letter dated 1893, Boyle describes a conversation with a Mohawk man named Peter Dockstater, who told him that the lake held the old works and that those who made them are the same who made the works at the river, by which he seemed to mean the St. Lawrence. Boyle notes that Dockstater seemed to regard the matter as settled and obvious, not as something requiring explanation, and that when pressed for more detail, Dockstater said only that the time for keeping quiet about it has been gone for some years now. The time for keeping quiet about it has been gone for some years now. This is the most explicit acknowledgement in the documented record that the silence was deliberate and had a temporal structure, a period when disclosure was prohibited and a period when it was permitted. The second is in the notes of ethnographer Frederick Waugh, who conducted fieldwork among the Six Nations in the 1910s. In notes from around 1912, Waugh records a conversation with an elderly Onondaga woman who told him that her grandmother had seen the tops of the walls when the water was low, in the year of the very dry summer, roughly 2 generations before 1912, putting it in the late 1840s or early 1850s. The tops of the walls when the water was low. This is testimony transmitted through 1 generation of direct visual observation. Not inference from acoustic anomalies or symbolic reference, but someone saying she could see masonry breaking the surface during a period of low lake level. Lake Ontario experiences significant year-to-year variation in water level. In the pre-regulation era, before the St. Lawrence Seaway altered hydrological management beginning in the 1950s, natural level fluctuation could span several feet between high and low years. A particularly dry year in the 1840s or 1850s, combined with submerged features sitting close to the low water surface, could produce exactly what War's informant described. The documentary and ethnographic record converges on claims that are individually fragmentary and collectively coherent. There are structures, or something that behaves structurally in acoustic surveys, on portions of the Lake Ontario floor. If they exist, they are built from stone not native to the region. The Haudenosaunee knew of them, maintained knowledge through formal channels, and declined to share that knowledge for as long as the conditions motivating secrecy remained in force. Those conditions changed in the 1870s. The disclosures describe construction, purpose, and material in terms consistent with the acoustic and geological evidence. What the record does not tell us is who built these structures, when, and using what technology. The who question has at least three candidate answers: an early Holocene population, occupying the exposed lake bed during a low lake stand; a pre-Confederacy culture with more sophisticated construction capacity than the archaeological record credits; or the Tartarian infrastructure hypothesis in its stronger form. Remnants of a civilization with technical capabilities not accounted for in the conventional historical narrative, whose presence in the Lake Ontario region is one of many distributed signatures of a global infrastructure tradition. Each answer has different implications for how we read the silence. If the first is correct, the tradition represents a remarkable instance of multi-millennial oral transmission, awareness of specific physical features maintained across 10,000 years of cultural change. That would itself be extraordinary. If the second is correct, the tradition preserves knowledge of an earlier cultural period whose physical remains are submerged. The silence would reflect a desire to protect the remnants from appropriation. If the third is correct, the Haudenosaunee inherited stewardship of structures they did not build, whose significance they understood well enough to maintain centuries of silence about. The decision to begin disclosing in the 1870s would not be driven by the collapse of colonial resistance, but by the recognition that the infrastructure was no longer functional, meaning what had once required protection no longer needed it. If there were once systems on the floor of Lake Ontario that interacted with the lake's hydrology or acoustics in some engineered way, the period of their cessation might be the period when disclosure became permissible, not because the colonizers won, but because whatever was being protected no longer needed protection. What remains, if anything, is inert. The walls still stand, but the mechanism is gone. The Haudenosaunee experienced devastating losses of territory and political autonomy across several centuries. If the silence was maintained purely by cultural integrity and political will, there were plenty of earlier periods when both were under equal or greater pressure than in the 1870s. The specific timing of disclosure invites an explanation beyond political circumstance. The available explanation is dock status. The time for keeping quiet about it has been gone for some years now. The conversation was in 1893, meaning something changed a decade or two earlier that made disclosure appropriate. Whatever that change was, it is not recorded in a source we have access to. It may have been a physical observation, a change in the lake in what was detectable from the surface, in some property of the structures indicating full deactivation. Or it may have been a decision taken in accordance with principles entirely internal to the Haudenosaunee tradition. What the record tells us is that there was a condition, a change in that condition, and a decision that followed. Lake Ontario today is a managed system. Level fluctuations are controlled within a narrower range than pre-regulation natural variation, and the lake is monitored with a thoroughness no previous period could match. And yet the floor of Lake Ontario, in the specific areas identified as anomalous by the 1972 survey, has not been the subject of a published targeted investigation. Side scan sonar, sub-bottom profiling, remotely operated vehicles capable of visual inspection at the relevant depths. all available and all deployed elsewhere in Great Lakes investigations. Not deployed at the 4 locations returning anomalous acoustic signatures. The 1972 survey found something anomalous. The anomalies correspond geographically to what the Haudenosaunee oral tradition identifies as significant underwater locations. The oral tradition describes construction in non-local stone with a functional purpose related to the management of the lake itself. The acoustic evidence is consistent with consolidated non-sedimentary material at locations that would have been above water during early Holocene lake low stands. The investigation that would resolve this has not been conducted. Harold Fenn filed his report. He recorded the elders' refusal to speak and moved on. That record sat in an archive for over a century, cited occasionally in unrelated contexts, never followed to the question it implies. The elder said, "Some knowledge was not given to be shared with those who had not already found it. What he meant is that the knowledge was available, there to be found, but it required the work of finding before it could be shared. It was not hidden, simply not handed to those who had not yet sought it." The floor of Lake Ontario is accessible to modern survey technology. The archives containing the fragmentary record of Haudenosaunee disclosure are publicly available. The 1972 survey data is declassified. Hale's notes are in Toronto. Boyle's letters are in the Royal Ontario Museum. War's notes are at the Canadian Museum of History. The evidence has been accumulating in fragments for years. The acoustic anomalies are there. The testimony is there. The geographical correspondence is there. The question is not whether there is something worth finding. The question is whether anyone with the tools to look will decide to look. The walls still stand.